Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is Sophie Lampton. She became a professional classical music critic at the age of 17 when she began writing for Musical Opinion, Britain's oldest music magazine. She's the author of the Callas Imprint, a centennial biography, which was published to coincide with Maria Callas's 100th birthday, December last year. She has some interesting thoughts on what the upcoming Angelina Jolie biopic gets wrong about Maria Callas. Welcome to the show, Sophia.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. So I know you put a massive amount of time and research and work into the biography that you put together last year. It must have been wonderful to do. Well,
it took 12 years altogether. I started research pretty much when I was 17, but I didn't decide to write a book until I was 18. So it's been a really, really long, arduous journey.
Yeah. And there's a lot of kind of, not myths necessarily, but Maria Callas is often portrayed in a certain way. And you want to let people know that a lot of the ways in which she's portrayed, particularly negatively, isn't true.
Yeah, she is very unfortunately portrayed incorrectly very, very, very often by different biographers. I think also the perceptions of her fans are often even incorrect because unfortunately, a lot of people think that she was entitled, spoilt, diva-ish. Conversely, a lot of other people think that she was a victim who sacrificed herself for love, and neither of these myths are true. I decided to write this book because when I was 17 years old, YouTube played me, I think probably on autoplay, because I must have been listening to Callas recordings. YouTube played me some interviews with her, and I realized she was, first of all, addicted to music. She was an absolute workaholic. And I found her so relatable and so likable. So I just kept listening to interviews and, eventually buying books. And I'd like to tell your listeners about Maria Callas because I'm sure there must be some out there who have heard recordings, so hopefully some fans as well. Maria Callas was a team player. From a very early age, she was working from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. from her teenage years, practicing, imagining operas in her head on a bus. She would say, the poet speaks of the mind's eye. There is the mind's ear. There's lots of work you can do in the mind, for which you don't need a piano or a rehearsal. She would help her colleagues when she was living in Athens, and her colleagues who didn't know Italian or even English. She would write out, for instance, the libretto of Puccini's Aida in Greek letters so that her tenor colleague could sing it. She was incredibly gracious to her fans, whom she would welcome into her dressing room at 3 a.m. She at one point even welcomed a group of girls standing outside her apartment in Paris into her home.
Wow.
And when they started chatting, describing themselves, because they were about 16 years old and they had a little Callas fan club of French girls, she remembered their fan letters and started quoting them back to them.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah, she was quite, I wouldn't say she was a casual person, but she was a very lovely person to know. I mean, in 1961, when her lawyer's daughter got locked out of her hotel room in Monte Carlo, she just said, well, why don't you sleep in my hotel room? And that seems to be the absolute antithesis of what the majority of portrayals of her, both fictitious, meaning both in biopics or in fictional novels or in biographies, set out, the way they set out to depict her. Because she was understandable, she was likable, and she had an enormous amount of empathy. And I think those who have heard her and felt something would also like her to a person, as a person, obviously to varying degrees. But there is a lot there you can relate to.
Oh, absolutely. She's often portrayed as having cheated on her husband as well with Onassis, and you're saying that definitely wasn't true.
That wasn't true. And the funny thing is she openly said that wasn't true, but nobody took her seriously. I actually found documents from the period that proved that wasn't true, even though she was saying that, from the very beginning. So she was married to a guy much older than she was, 28 years older, in fact, because she really needed a father figure in her life. Unfortunately, she didn't have very caring parents, especially her mother, who was especially dismissive and negligent. And so she fell in love with a much older guy, and they were having a good marriage for a long time. But he was also her manager. He was using her as a business venture, and he really was trying to push her to sing more and more, including he would say, well, why don't you sing in Las Vegas? We've had a proposition for you to sing Las Vegas. And she was trying to prove, no, opera singers don't do Las Vegas. They don't do cabaret. But he was not very interested in music. He was pushing her in that direction. He was actually the one who proposed that they go on a cruise on the yacht of Aristotle Onassis, who was already by then a very celebrated Greek shipping magnate. But they got into, Callas and her husband, they got into an argument because she found out he had invested basically her income, because they were living on her money, that he had invested it in forgeries of paintings. And Onassis just happened to be there, and she consulted Onassis for financial advice because he was this incredibly successful businessman. And her husband got very, very offended by this. And Callas eventually told him, look, I want to, let's keep this marriage going. We've been together already. They've been together 12 years, married for 10. How about I manage my career? I do it myself. And he said, well, if that's the way you want it, we're not staying together anymore. And he left her. And then he made up this story that she had gone off with Onassis. And maybe he thought that in his rage, but it wasn't true. And then he would blackmail her and say, well, if Onassis doesn't give me money, I'm going to go to the press with more stories about this. And she mentioned this in a letter to her, we call it a legal separation lawyer, because at the time in Italy, there was no divorce because Italy was Catholic. Divorce in Italy wouldn't be legal until 1971. So he was her legal separation lawyer, Augusto Calcini. She would write to him saying, can you tell Meneghini's lawyer to stop issuing threats about going to report a made-up story? And she underlines made-up story herself with her own handwriting, meaning I was not cheating with Onassis. Now, it is true that later on, she and Onassis did have a relationship, but this was months after her own husband left her.
Fascinating. And what do we know about her relationship with Onassis and the myths that are portrayed about that?
Well, her relationship with Onassis, not to put off potential readers here, but it wasn't very interesting. Firstly, Maria Callas, she was a very passionate woman, but she was actually not particularly sexual. So it wasn't a relationship it's often portrayed to be like, a Burton and Taylor, passionate people, tempestuous people relationship. It wasn't that at all. They were very supportive of each other in the beginning. And Onassis, actually, knowing that at the time she was already experiencing very severe vocal problems, they had begun a long time before Callas and Onassis had hooked up. And Onassis actually tried to arrange for her to have a Maria Callas television production company so that she could pre-record concerts without the fear of having to do it live and all that extreme tension that goes with that. But she didn't like the idea of pre-recorded. She was a stage artist, so she didn't go along with that. And as her vocal problems got worse, he also he communicated with Jack Warner. I found a letter from him to Jack Warner in an archive. He communicated with Jack Warner of Warner Brothers and also with Spiros Skouras, the chairman of 20th Century Fox, to try and get a film version of the opera Tosca, which is an opera Callas sang many times. Again, she didn't want to go through with that because she didn't like the idea. She herself would say she didn't like the idea of opera on film. They really were very affectionate with each other for a long time. But also, I will add, they never lived together. They were very independent people, each devoted to their own careers. Onassis additionally had children from his marriage to Athena Livanos, from whom he had separated by the time he got together with Callas. But they lived in separate residences, and half the year at least they were basically having a long distance relationship. Eventually they did get on each other's nerves because Onassis got very insecure, and Callas also was getting insecure from her own vocal problems. Onassis was getting insecure on account of his business failures because he had an airline called Olympic Airways, which was struggling immensely and making lots of losses. And actually, there's an interesting diary entry from a friend of Callas's called Dorle Soria, who talks about Callas complaining to her, saying, Onassis, he's so stubborn. He won't see a doctor about his nerves. He says it's not the business of a doctor. He didn't want to see, a therapist, and she was trying to persuade him to. So it's kind of the day-to-day tedium of being in a relationship, except that eventually she left him. And his housekeeper, Georgia Vetta, said actually he was so distraught that he didn't eat or sleep. I don't know if that's true, but he must have had some trouble. And he tried to get her back by sending her bouquets, but she wouldn't come back. And then shortly after, he married Jacqueline Kennedy, but she left him. she was not abandoned for Jacqueline Kennedy. And to this day, every single day, somebody in an article, or very often an article or on social media says, oh, Jack, you know, a NASA's left of Jacqueline Kennedy. What a tragedy. And that's just not true.
Gosh, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, it seems that there's some kind of trend to victimize some of these late female performers. Edith Piaf is another one. Marilyn Monroe, of course.
Absolutely.
Amy Winehouse. I mean, not saying they didn't have some form of tragedies in their lives and were troubled women, but are you saying, you know, sometimes there's a bit of untruth in these things?
Well, I can only judge in terms of Callas. I can't judge in terms of Edith Piaf or Amy Winehouse or Marilyn Monroe. But as somebody who enjoys the music of Edith Piaf, I'm not a big Amy Winehouse fan, but I do recognize her immense voice. I have, you know, just as a viewer and a listener, noticed that reports really want to reduce these female artists to being nothing but objects on the receiving end of various plights and tragedies. And of course, a lot of performing artists go through tragedies. It is true that performing artists, the greater they are, it tends to be the case that the greater they are, the more dramatic their life is. But I don't see the point in that. I don't see the point in reporting that from that angle when you're talking about artists who have contributed so much to music or theatre or film or literature. It doesn't matter which field it is. You're talking about people who gave the audience a lot. And really, my vision for this biography was to try to reconcile Maria Callas with her own fans, which is not to say that they're upset at her. I don't think they are, but I think they don't know her well. And knowing how loved she is, you know, you go on YouTube and there are videos with 25 million views, you know, 25 million views today.
Gosh.
Why not? I'm not saying you're going to love her as a person and she would have been your, you know, best friend, but why not try to know somebody the way you would in real life? So when you meet a person in real life, usually you might have some, you know, preconception if you've been told, oh, so-and-so did this and this happened. But usually you're kind of open-minded. And first of all, you want to see, who is this person? Is this person kind? Is this person easy to talk to? And I really wanted to introduce the readers that way. So let's get to know the way she is as a, you know, socially first, shall we say, as a woman, as someone you talk to. And then we can, as we get to know her, we can dive into her private life, just as you would in real life. And what the tabloids tend to do with all artists, men and women, you know, everybody basically, is they try to do it the other way around, as if you can define somebody through a headline, any headline. And that's the whole story. Which is, it's not true for anybody. Not true for anybody at all.
It's like they want there to be a dramatic story. They want the person to have been on a journey and been through immense tragedy and come out the other side. You know, people like that kind of thing.
Well, often they don't want the person to have come out the other side. I mean, they certainly, at least from my perspective with Callas, the mass majority of tabloids in all different kinds of languages do not want her to have come out the other side. It's so misleading, and it gave me a revelation about my own personal tendency to judge artists I was not that familiar with. You know, I don't really know anything about Marilyn Monroe. I mean, I've seen her and I've heard her sing, but I'm not going to judge anything on the basis of some rumors, because when the tabloids are trying to manipulate you, that's not to do with the person they're allegedly talking about.
Yeah. And as we know, so many tabloid stories are just completely made up. You know, lots of celebrities who are still with us have, you know, joked on television and said, the amount of headlines I've read about myself that completely aren't true, whether it's to do with someone that they've supposedly been on a date with and they haven't even met. I mean, all kinds of things, you know, so we can't trust what we're reading in the tabloids a lot of the time, especially when it's celebrity gossip.
Yeah, and Callas was saying as early as, she was saying all of that in the early 60s when the paparazzi were really only just gathering steam. But even in 1970, she said, there are whole interviews with me I've read that were just made up. I never met the person. I was never contacted by the person. And they're just entirely invented interviews.
Wow. It's unbelievable that that's ever been allowed to happen, isn't it? I mean, it makes my interview before you was with a local newspaper journalist talking about journalism from a local newspaper point of view. And, you know, people get into journalism because they want to report fact and stories. So the idea of making things up, I just don't get, other than the point of selling the papers, of course.
Well, I think, you said the word story. The thing is, it can only really be a story if it's interesting. And there are a lot of elements of everybody's lives, including Maria Callas's, that are just not that interesting. So, I mean, I'm a classical music critic, but I have some background with, you know, conversations with journalists, meaning investigative reporters. Just in my personal perspective, obviously I haven't done a study of this, but from my personal perspective, it's always about what is our story? What's the lead? What's the story? Yeah. Sometimes it just isn't a story. And as Callas herself said, you know, she actually said, well, I don't really blame them. They have to put out all this information every day. And she was saying this in 1958. When there were fewer newspapers, there were fewer magazines, and there was no internet, and there was much less television and much less radio. And she was saying this back then. She, you know, because there were silly rumors. At one point, a pasta company said, "Oh, Callas lost weight owing to our pasta. That was all our pasta," and she couldn't believe it. But she said, "Well, you know, I suppose that's their job. They have their job. I have my job, and they have to put something out."
Well, that shows how nice she was and reasonable to think like that. Not many people would think that, would they?
Well, I mean, I will admit she did file some lawsuits because some of the things that the media said were so egregiously untrue. And unfortunately, it doesn't change, at least in her case, didn't change anything, because by the time the lawsuit has gone through, often several years have passed, and that victory is not reported in the press, which means that the original scoop is the thing that gets reported as truth, not the correction months or years later that's kind of in the small print. Oh, by the way, we made a mistake several years ago. Unfortunately, that's just, at least with her, that was the way that was.
Oh, we still see that now all the time.
Absolutely.
All the time.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been fascinating having you with us on the show. Sophia Lampton, thank you very much for joining us. And if listeners want to learn more about the real Maria Callas, they should definitely get a copy of your book, The Callas Imprint, a Centennial Biography. It's available on our website, TRE.radio. Sophia, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.